So, as far as I know, all teachers have, at some point, a dream where everybody simply stops listening. Like the whole social contract we sign at the doors of the school has simply dissolved. Whatever authority we had in front of the class with our whiteboard and our position as teacher has simply disappeared, and all the control is lost along with the ability to do the job. We need students to buy into the coercive structures of exams and university admissions, but deeper than that, we need them to buy into the idea that learning is its own reward. That respect for each other and meaningful collaboration in the pursuit of knowledge will result in joy if you just give it a try. But more than that, we also need them to buy into the hierarchies of curiosity that schools construct. An interest in math, science, English, and history is valued more than an interest in art, music, or athletics, for example. When we lose buy-in at any of these levels, the culture of the room breaks down. The nightmare is that we've lost all the buy-in. And this seems true of most social contracts. There are laws and consequences for misbehavior that come from some source of authority, while there's also an authentic impulse to be good citizens outside of that authority. At the same time, different cultures will construct their own hierarchies of value. Like you can imagine a school that values art over the sciences, or physical education over math. In the Vienna of Measure for Measure, it seems like everybody has stopped buying into the external authority of the law and have begun to craft their own moral hierarchies. Vienna used to value chastity in the way that schools value English class, for example, but Pompey, Overdone, and Lucio have come to the conclusion that this so-called virtue is repressive. Both Isabella and Angelo, however, are respected by the old system of authority because they exemplify chastity. The Duke gives Angelo legal authority through the power to enforce the laws. Isabella has social influence with those traditional forms of power because of her reputation for chastity. In Act 3, we saw what happens when a community stops buying into the traditional sources of authority in a community. They've stopped paying attention to the coercive force of laws and stopped caring about chastity. And in Act 4, we are introduced to a character named Barnardine, a man with no buy-in for the social contract at all. The play examines social forces of coercion, the justice system that imposes values outside the individual, and the indoctrination of value systems into the individual to police themselves. As always, it will not provide us with any answers, but today we'll look at some of the ways the play frames the issues of buy-in or coercion by taking Act 4 play by play. Act 4 begins with the Duke dressed as a friar meeting with Isabella and Mariana to organize the bed switch. Isabella has told Angelo that she will meet him, alone, in silence, in pitch dark, in order to exchange her virginity for her brother's life. In reality, it will be Mariana in the bed. The plan obviously requires that Mariana be on board with this for it to work. She needs to agree to sleep with Angelo, thus validating their previous marriage nuptials, even though it's clearly an act of deception and might be viewed as a sex act outside of marriage. Mariana outsources the decision. She says she'll do it if the friar advises it. Her consent to the plan depends on the blessing of this friar, who is not a friar. He's the Duke, with political power, but without the spiritual power associated with the church. He can prevent her body from going to prison, but not her soul from going to hell. So that's complicated. A blurry line between civic power and religious power. He can say it's legal, but not that it's sinful, and he's doing it anyway. So though the coercive power of this disguise as a friar, and more generally his status as a man, he is able to get the buy-in from both Isabella and Mariana to do this crazy thing. Scene 2 of Act 4 opens with Pompey agreeing to be the executioner's assistant. He's going to execute people in exchange for forgiveness from his work in the brothel. He says, "Sir, I have been an unlawful bawd time out of mind, but yet I will be content to be a lawful hangman." And this is that constructed hierarchy of values thing I was just talking about. This whole situation just calls attention to the ways meaning is derived through the stories we tell. He agrees to end a man's life by chopping off his head. By agreeing to this, he will be forgiven for the sin of facilitating a sex act. The killing people part will be legal because the system says it's legal. The sex part, well, even the hangman, abhors him, thinks that letting a bawd participate in executions will discredit his profession. In a culture that privileges chastity, the sin of facilitating sex can be redeemed through killing those who actually engaged in a sex act. That's just crazy. The provost then calls for Claudio and Barnardine. He says Claudio has his pity, but that Barnardine is a murderer and deserves nothing. Claudio arrives promptly and is told once again that he's going to die in the morning. Barnardine doesn't show up. He simply doesn't agree to the rules everybody else does. If the provost calls, you're supposed to go. If the teacher says, put your phones away, you're supposed to put your phones away. That's what buying into the social contract looks like. Barnardine is the nightmare, and yet he's one of the best parts of this play for me. More on that later. The Duke, dressed as a friar, then shows up to patiently wait for Claudio's pardon. The bed switch plan should be the ransom required to free Claudio, but the opposite turns out to be true. Angelo, having slept with the person he believes to be Isabella, sends word that Claudio is to be executed immediately. By exchanging her virginity, though not really, Isabella has actually hastened her brother's death rather than saved his life. Angelo seems to have underestimated the coercive power of fear, specifically the fear of shame and loss of reputation. Also, it seems like Angelo didn't acquire the virtue through the experience of Isabella's body like he thought he would. Who would have guessed that? This comes as a surprise to the Duke, who instructs the provost to kill Barnardine instead of Claudio and send Barnardine's head instead of Claudio's to satisfy the deceived Angelo. And this is really interesting for two reasons. First, because everyone here seems to be conspiring against the rule of law. Like, the provost doesn't know the man in front of him is the Duke. This is some random friar who simply has buy-in because he's dressed as a friar, but also because nobody wants to kill Claudio in this play. So Angelo has lost the ability to enforce the laws by trying to enforce the law against somebody who, according to individual conscience of everyone around, didn't do anything wrong. The other interesting thing here is that we get to learn a little bit about Barnardine. He's been a prisoner for 9 years. He's a murderer. He's drunk frequently and doesn't seem to repent. He could have left the prison as he's had opportunities to escape, but he just doesn't. He just lives in prison, drunk. In the following scene, Pompey and Abhorsum call on him to be executed, and he simply says, "I've been drinking all night, and I'm not fitted for it." He basically says he's too tired and hungover to be executed today. He's just not playing by any of the rules. The Duke, again, dressed as the friar, says that he'll help Barnardine, provide comfort and all that. Barnardine's response? "I swear I'll not die today for any man's persuasion. Neither the civic nor the religious have any influence on him." He just walks away. He says, "If you have anything to say to me, come to my ward, for thence will not I today." He's just not going to leave his cell. If they want him to talk, they need to go to him. But he's not moving for anybody else. He will not consent. He has no buy-in for the laws or norms or constructed hierarchies of power or anyone's crazy switcheroo plans. He's just not here for it. So they need a head to send to Angelo to prove that they've executed Claudio. They can't send Barnardine's head because he won't do it. So they agree to send the head of a man that they executed yesterday, Ragozine, who looks more like Claudio anyway. Ragozine, the substitute for a substitute in a play filled with substitutions. The provost leaves with the head, and everybody agrees to put Barnardine and Claudio in a hidden cell. In the next video, we'll unpack this strange grouping of Claudio and Barnardine, but we'll have to leave that one alone for now. As the provost exits, Isabella arrives on the stage, and something really disturbing happens. The Duke, who knows Claudio is alive and safe, decides to tell Isabella that Claudio has been executed. He says he'll keep her ignorant so that she can be comforted when she least expects it. And he's basically trying to force a psychological collapse so that he can build her back up again. It's just gross. He then outlines another plan for her, which, the last one didn't work. The new plan is that upon the Duke's public return, she is going to publicly accuse Angelo. In scene 6, Isabella and Mariana rehearse this plan, totally guided by the Duke/Friar's plan. They're both totally bought in, even though the bed switch plan, his previous idea, did not have the intended effects. But before that, we have scene 4, where Angelo hears of the Duke's return. Angelo, alone on the stage, explains himself to the audience. Isabella won't talk because if she admits to sleeping with him, she will also admit to losing her chastity, which is the source of any power that she has in the play. Additionally, he had to kill Claudio because if Claudio lived, he might have taken revenge on Angelo. At this point in the play, Angelo realizes that he was tested by his position of power and that he totally failed. His public position, rather than being a torch of virtue lighting the way for everybody else, resulted in him abusing his power to force Isabella to sleep with him and murdering Claudio. He believes that he'll get away with it, legally, publicly, but he won't escape the guilt. That's his private punishment. So we have a bunch of characters coerced into behaviors by different forces. Isabella relies on the friar to guide her behavior through a combination of distrust in Angelo and trust in the church. Mariana is coerced through desperate love of Angelo. Angelo is coerced by his internal shame and fear. Poppy becomes an executioner because it carries more cultural prestige than a barman in a brothel. The provost is coerced into undermining the laws through an internal sense of justice and the validation he gets from a fake friar. And finally, Barnardine lives in a prison of his own making, outside of any of these external coercive forces. And that takes us to Act 5, which we'll be discussing play-by-play next week. Subscribe if you want to be notified when that video is published. Thank you for watching.